Peter, thank you so much for that introduction, and I feel you've almost given my talk for me. So the theme, light and dark sides of adolescence, it's the theme of myth, legend, fairy tale. In our modern times, we've had Star Wars, we've had teenage vampires, and for those of you who are fans, we've had Harry Potter. Themes of light and dark are so deeply embedded in the Harry Potter stories, as are some themes that we're going to be talking about today. The themes of how does a child make the transition from childhood to adulthood? How does Harry get there? How does Hermione get there? Is it biology? Is it the social environment? So does it matter whether the sorting hat puts you in Gryffindor or Slytherin? Or is it some magical interaction between the two? Those are the questions we're going to be looking at today. And those are the questions that the Lancet Commission on Adolescent Health and Wellbeing looked at over the past 2.5 years. The report was published in May 2016, and it brought together professors of education, professors of neuroscience, professors of law, together with those in social science, behavioral science, public health, and clinical medicine. And it is a report that is actually one reflecting the global picture of adolescent health. So we had those disciplines from the global north as well as the global south, and we also had those working at the policy interface together with young people come together. So I'm going to take you a little bit through some of the questions that we addressed in that report. 3 questions for today, each 4 minutes. So what's changed about adolescence? How do we understand health, growth, well-being during these years? And how are we doing in terms of public policy settings for adolescent health and well-being? Okay, before we get to what's changed, some terminology about adolescence. So if you read the literature, you'll find all kinds of terms that have been used. The term adolescence is one that is used widely in the UN system to refer to 10 to 19-year-olds. The term youth refers to those 15 to 24. It doesn't really capture that sentinel event of puberty, which really marks the onset of adolescence. Young people is the age group 10 through to 24 that you'll also hear. In the report that we had with the Lancet, we used adolescents to refer to 10 to 24-year-olds, and I'll explain why. There are other terms that you'll come across as well, depending on who you're talking to. These terms around early, mid, childhood, early adolescence, and sometimes you'll come across a term like the middle years. It's a term from education to refer to the early adolescent years, but also captures a little bit of late childhood. So lots of confusing terminology in this area, but where I'd like you to be thinking about adolescence and how I'd like you to be conceptualizing it is a phase of life that begins with a sentinel biological event, which is puberty, and ends in the historical sense with the transition to parenthood and marriage. And I'd like to take you back 10,000 years in terms of how adolescence has changed. So using that concept of adolescence and thinking about menarche, the onset of periods of menstruation in girls as a marker of reproductive maturity. That transition and the transition to parenthood were closely aligned. For girls, the gap in pre-industrial societies everywhere was 2 years. For boys, it was about 4. And then about 200 years ago, at the time of the Industrial Revolution, something remarkable began to happen. Those events began to diverge. It accelerated in the mid-20th century with the advent of modern contraception. So that with this divergence of menarche and the transition to parenthood, we see adolescence emerging. Adolescence is a social construct. Maybe a social construct, but as a portion of the life course, it takes up a longer period of the life course than ever before in human history. Therefore, what happens in these years is more important than at any time in human history. Okay, question 2, how do we understand health and well-being during these years? Now, I figure that some of you, we've all been through puberty. I figure for some of it's a long time ago. But many of us have had children who've gone through puberty. And the thing that you'll remember about what happened at puberty, kids grow. So I've got a son who's 6'4", up here. Many of you might have had a similar experience. That happened at puberty. You may be surprised to learn that a whole lot of physical systems mature with puberty and during the adolescent years. So you might say, well, the section of reproductive health systems, they mature, they do. So too do the metabolic systems. So too do the cardiorespiratory systems mature during these years. And what happens in terms of their growth during these years really matters for health across the life course. But if it's an age of anything, it's an age of brain development. And you know, we didn't know this until about 20 years ago. Until that time, we thought brain development stopped at the age of 7 years. How did we think that? Well, that's when brains reach their peak size, something like their adult size. We had no neuroimaging studies to tell us anything different. Now we know that that's where the really interesting bits of brain development really get going. Let me try and explain. So puberty begins at what age? First hormonal changes? It's about grade 7. So when kids are in mid-primary school, about grade 3 in the Australian context. Nobody much notices when puberty begins, except the girls in grade 4. Do you know what they say about the boys? They've begun to smell. Those are the first hormonal changes of puberty. Nobody else much notices, though. It's followed by a cascade of hormonal changes that continue right through the adolescent years, and they're accompanied by a cascade of changes in brain. Maturation initially of the subcortical centers involved in emotional processing, followed by maturation of the prefrontal cortex involved in higher executive functioning. And that introduces a phase of functioning unlike anything else in the life course. This is an age of incredible creativity. It's an age of discovery. It's an age where the individual begins to reach out beyond the family of origin, to the wider world, to the peer group, to the media. So it's a time of incredible opportunity, and how that engagement happens with social, the emotional, the nutritional, the cultural environment shapes everything about the individual. It shapes identity, it shapes capabilities, cognitive, social, emotional, profoundly. It's also a time of vulnerability to problems related to emotion and emotional control, and it may be no surprise to you that around 3/4 of all mental disorders begin before the age of 25, mostly in the adolescent years. So I hope I've captured sort of something here of the excitement of these years, how this brings a very different interaction with the world. So what does that world look like for the adolescent? Well, it's a very different world to the world of a child. The adolescent, for a start, is shaping that social environment in a way that younger children do not. As with younger children, the social, cultural, historical, religious, and economic context is a background to everything that happens in these years and influences the institutions which are the immediate influences on development of adolescence. Those, none is more important than families. Families remain the cornerstone of life during the adolescent years for most. If you're not within a family, you're really disadvantaged. Yet this is a time where families are changing, and historically it's been the time of moving from a family of origin to a family of one's own. And how that transition happens is profoundly important in terms of your health and well-being throughout the life course and right into the next generation. And it's a transition which is becoming difficult in a lot of parts of the world because it's related to this transition, the one from education to employment, where young people around the globe are struggling. So in North Africa and the Middle East, there is a new phenomenon. It's called waithood, waiting to be able to make the transition to a family of one's own. Economic circumstances do not allow it for many young people, and it's a major problem. It's a problem of health, it's a problem of civil society, it's a problem that's causing a great deal of unrest. But if it's an age of anything, what is it? It's the age of the peer group. This is the time in life where you spend more time with your peers than at any other point in life, and how that interaction with your peers happens shapes everything about your attitudes, values, beliefs going forward. And I want you to reflect for a moment on how peer groups have changed in such a short period of time. Mass media, social and digital media, social and digital media have been around for a little more than a decade, but the peer group now has changed from the kids in the village that you were growing up with, or more recently in the local neighborhood, to the 1.8 billion young people on the planet, potentially. This is having profound effects on our lives as adults, but on this generation more than any other. And I want you to sort of give you an idea of how the peer group works in terms of adolescent development. And I want you to consider this group of young boys. So they're Tibetan monks. I could have taken characters from Harry Potter, but I'm taking Tibetan monks. So I'd like to ask you, what are they competing on for social status within the peer group? So there are some higher ideals of Buddhism that they're aspiring to. The immediate values are those of piety, generosity, humility. He who exemplifies those characteristics is top dog within this group of young Tibetan monks. I'd like you to contrast that with this group of young men. Guatemalan gang members, what do they compete on? Well, they compete on defending the gang, no higher ideal. They're competing on values of aggression, violence, misogyny. That is shaping their life chances profoundly. It's also shaping the life chances of those around them, including women who they might partner with. Just to illustrate again, this is a time where we can open opportunities and we can close them down. Early parenthood closes down opportunities for young women around the world still. Education opens them up. And one of the recommendations from our commission is the best thing we can do for adolescent health and well-being is provide quality education. Moving to the third and last question, which is public policy and how we're doing. We had a number of recommendations, 6 in all, in the Commission report. And the first of those was we need a broader lens when we're thinking about adolescent health and well-being. This is where our lens has been in the global context. It's been around, in some places, HIV, mostly sub-Saharan Africa, and sexual and reproductive health. And I want you to ask a question about sexual and reproductive health and what that relates to in the lives of young women. Well, it relates to their mental health. It relates deeply to their nutritional state. It relates to experiences of violence and sexual violence in particular. It relates to substance abuse in their partners. It relates to infectious diseases. It relates to everything in health. And so where we recommended we needed to move to in terms of health policies is a much broader view of adolescent health than we've traditionally had. We took it longer and broader than that. We said, look, we've got to place adolescence within the life course. Remember, it's a bigger part of the life course than it has ever been. And if we get our policy settings right about keeping kids in education and delaying early parenthood, it'll be longer still in most places. Our focus in health tends to be on health problems and the health service system, but a whole lot of other things that are important in health of adolescents are actually beyond that. The health risks, tobacco, for example, doesn't cause disease during the adolescent years, but it's a profound cause of disease later in life. Gender inequity does cause problems during the adolescent years. They're established, gender norms are established in these years. They continue into adulthood and into the next generation. This is the opportunity for intervention. If we get this right in terms of our policy settings, we get a triple dividend. We get reduced death and disability during the adolescent years. We get a healthier trajectory in life across the life course, and because this is the next generation to parent, the healthiest possible start to life for the next generation. So, in the Australian setting, what do we do in terms of adolescent health? Well, I call it issue du jour in terms of policy. Sometimes we focus on things like substance abuse. There's a peak in heroin overdoses, and so we need to focus on drugs. Or it might be that we need to focus on violence. Or it might be that we focus on mental health, education. Never have we been in a position where we've actually focused on a comprehensive picture of adolescent health and well-being, and it looks something like this. And that's something I hope we come back to. But how are we doing in Australia? Now, this is, it's a technical slide. It's a heat map illustrating a measure called a DALY. A DALY takes into account years of life lost due to premature death and years of life lived with diseases causing disability. And I want you to focus on these two columns here, which are the NCD DALYs, which are the dominant cause of disease burden in adolescents in high-income countries. So this is mental disorders, substance use disorders, and chronic physical illness. And I'd like to show you how Australia is doing, Australian adolescents are doing, in relation to other relatively high-income countries around the world. I could have presented you sort of findings around education, and they would have been, in some ways, quite similar. So the good news, if we compare ourselves to the Anglophone countries, is we're doing better than the Kiwis, just. And we're doing a little bit better than kids growing up in the United States. But we're not doing as well as those growing up in the UK and Canada. If we compare ourselves to Western Europe, adolescents are actually doing better in terms of disease burden than kids in Australia. And, believe it or not, it's kids in East Asia, the high-income countries of East Asia, who are doing better, best of all, in terms of disease burden during the adolescent years. Now, why is this? Well, we don't really know the answer to this, and the reason why we don't know the answer is this map here. We in Australia are not collecting comparative data about the health and well-being of our adolescents. There are two data collection systems around the globe. One is the health and well-being of school-aged children, which is shown in green. The blue represents the Global School Health Survey, and you see that Australia and New Zealand both stand out for not collecting data on health and well-being during the early adolescent years. It's a reflection, I think, of the policy neglect that we've had of these years, and we need to turn that around. So I'm going to leave you with this picture, which is a somewhat magical picture of Australian boys having a good time. It's a picture of health, thriving, well-being during these years. And these are the words on the front cover of the Standing Commission report. This generation of adolescents can transform all our futures. There is no greater priority in global health than ensuring they have the resources to do so. Thank you very much.